many of the most contentious issues in the national discourse are unfolding in New York City. You take migrancy, for example, that's the clearest case. And you have news outlets that are pretty much dedicated to pumping polarized takes on those situations, whether it's migration or crime or marijuana legalization, into the bloodstream of national cable and digital media. And the importance of having reality-based journalism about those subjects from a city that attracts so much attention is another role that New York City local news can play in the national discussion.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. This episode, I talk with Nic Dawes, Executive Director of The City, a nonprofit newsroom focused on serving New Yorkers through investigative reporting and service journalism. We discuss how the city fills real gaps that exist even in the media capital of the world. Nic shares how the outlet balances accountability reporting with practical issues such as navigating city services. He also explains their innovative approach to community engagement through open newsrooms and how they maintain a mission-focused strategy without chasing viral traffic. With a background that spans leadership roles at Human Rights Watch, Hindustan Times, and the Mail and Guardian, Nic reflects on the challenges of transitioning to a smaller, more focused team. He offers insights into nonprofit journalism's financial sustainability and the importance of cultivating partnerships and local trust to build a thriving civic information ecosystem. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Nic Dawes. Welcome, Nic, to the podcast. It's an honor to have you.
It's good to be here, Tim.
So why don't you start and just tell listeners about the city and why it's needed in the most media-rich place probably on Earth.
Yeah, New York City certainly is a very media-dense place. And if you look at New York City from a high altitude, it really looks that way. And you can see, the New York Times is a skyscraper on 8th Avenue. You can see the big broadcast outlets and cable companies on the Avenue of the Americas, and some startups spread across the city too. But underneath that glossy surface, there's been a really profound erosion of coverage of New York City itself, and coverage that is directed at New Yorkers, by New Yorkers, and for New Yorkers. That's obviously very uneven, right? If you live in the wealthiest parts of town, you can find journalism that's going to be relevant to you. There's lots of media about real estate in the tonier parts of Manhattan and brownstone Brooklyn, for example. But if you live further into the outer boroughs, or if you're really concerned with what's going on in city government and city agencies, there's just been a very, very, very serious reduction in the amount of coverage, bodies dedicated to that work. So the city was really founded in response to that issue, and a realization in the latter part of the 2010s that, the New York Times had pretty much declared that it was focusing on national and global audiences and reduced its metro coverage really significantly from about 2016 on. The Wall Street Journal actually shut down its Greater New York section in the middle of the mayoral election in 2021. Of course, the biggest retrenchment, if you like, has been at the Daily News, which was one of the two anchors of the New York City tabloid system, owned by the notorious hedge fund Alton Global, and really profoundly hollowed out. And that was a newsroom of around 300 people 20 years ago, with a huge metro team, people in the courts, people in covering the school system, people covering whole desks, covering these areas, just not there anymore. So New York is not a news desert, and that unit of analysis that is so powerful and helpful in the local news discussion doesn't really compute in New York, but it is a profoundly compromised news ecosystem. and we've ended up with a dominant, highly ideological tabloid in the form of the Post. Some local TV stations that try incredibly hard, but have also had deep budget cutbacks, focus heavily on crime, fires, those kinds of things. And we really need to rebuild coverage that both serves all New Yorkers and addresses some of those inequalities that I spoke to in terms of coverage, and that can tackle citywide issues at the level of the mayor, at the level of the city council, in a way that brings to bear really robust investigative reporting and service journalism. So that's the role that we're trying to play.
Yeah, and I think the media capital is also home to one of the canonical examples of the importance of a healthy local news ecosystem with George Santos. I mean, here in New York, there was a small local outlet that did uncover some of the lies and background, but largely went unnoticed until after he was elected. So the fact that there wasn't really strong local journalism, in his district, I think shows what happens to, and the impact nationally.
Yeah. And, and I would build on that even more, Tim, to say that many of the most contentious issues in the national discourse are unfolding in New York City. You take migrancy, for example, that's the clearest case. And you have news outlets that are pretty much dedicated to pumping polarized takes on those situations, whether it's migration or crime or marijuana legalization, into the bloodstream of national cable and digital media. And the importance of having reality-based journalism about those subjects from a city that attracts so much attention is another role that New York City local news can play in the national discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk a little bit about your structure and your setup. How many reporters do you have, and what do you focus on?
Yeah, so we have about 24 editorial staff total out of a team of 28, 29. And we have changed our structure a little bit recently, but our coverage is organized into two broad areas: accountability reporting, whether that is long-term investigations or quicker turnaround responses to developments. So accountability reporting, and then on the other hand, service journalism, and we view them as linked, and we view the service journalism as equally important as the accountability reporting. So we have a section on our website called How to New York, which offers both plain language guides and sometimes data-driven tools to help people navigate the complexities of life in this town, whether it's things like voting, or how to get your heat turned up in your apartment when it's cold in the winter, or how to deal with extreme weather. We have a whole series called How to Court, which is on dealing with criminal justice issues, how to get a free attorney, what happens when you're arrested, those kinds of things. So those are the two broad strands of our coverage. But then, of course, we have a degree of thematic organization within those categories. So we have reporters who cover classical beats like transit and the correction system, the police, climate change and the environment, labor, areas where we think we can add real value. We used to have a single reporter dedicated to each borough, and we've increasingly realized that's just not enough to be able to say that we really cover the whole city. Having one person in Brooklyn, great. There's 2.6 million people in Brooklyn. And so we have a phenomenal reporter, Gwen Hogan, who was our Brooklyn reporter, and that's still her center of gravity, but she also focuses on the migrant crisis and ranges more widely. So there's a little bit of dynamic beat assignment when something becomes a big issue. Our great investigative reporter, Rosalind Adams, has been covering the marijuana rollout, and that's essentially her beat at the moment, and it'll probably evolve into something else with time. But
yeah. So you're nonprofit, you're online, you have a weekday newsletter. What's your audience reach?
Yeah, so the newsletter goes to about 70,000 people a day. We actually have two at the moment. We also have a summer newsletter, which is a limited once a week thing, really fun. So the main newsletter goes to about 70,000 people. The summer newsletter goes to about 4,000 people. On our website, we reach anywhere between 500,000 or 600,000 and 1.5 million in a month, depending on the month. We probably average around 750,000 uniques, and we do 1.2, 1.5 million page views in a given month, about 20,000 downloads a month of the FAQ NYC podcast.
Yeah, and you describe the city as news for New Yorkers. One of the things that struck me, I think, for a lot of journalists and publishers, there would be a natural pull, particularly in a city like New York, which has international interest and lots of news stories, to really chase after traffic, right? That would appeal to people all over the globe. So how do you maintain that focus on New Yorkers and not get sucked into the allure of viral articles?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a few layers to the answer. The first thing is to keep saying we are for New Yorkers, and to remind ourselves of that and embed that in our culture. And that goes down to, whom we hire and what we incentivize internally. And when you've done that enough, when the temptation arises to say, for example, cover the Trump trial in great detail, where there are like 600 other news organizations in the scrum, to say, well, no, firstly, we can't add any value. And secondly, that's not what our mandate is, or not what our mission is. I'd think of a more complex case, the recent campus protests, which were very heavily covered, which were subject of huge international interest, and where we could have chased some numbers. And we didn't, because again, we knew that we would struggle to add value, and we were trying to think hard about the ways in which our coverage would be relevant for a New York City audience. And so, we kept a very close eye on things. We assigned a reporter to watch what was happening. And we could see that as the involvement of the NYPD increased, that the story, if we stayed in our lane, the story would veer into our lane. And indeed it did, and we broke the story that a police officer had discharged their firearm inside Columbia's Hamilton Hall. That forced the police to hold a press conference and explain why they hadn't admitted to this fact. The story actually did do huge numbers as well, and we were rewarded for staying in our lane. And then the last thing I would say is it a little bit matters what you measure. And I think it's been really tough for many people in our space to think about how we get beyond the headline metrics that you and I just talked about, like page views, uniques. Should I feel super happy that Apple News put a story on the home page and I got 5 million last month? Sure, I'm happy about it, but it's not a core return to our mission. So we are trying to look more at the metrics of quality that show that we're building direct relationships and longer term relationships with our audience. So focusing more on returning visits than on absolute visits, and seeing how those are growing. Focusing more on the newsletter, and seeing what's happening with the absolute size of those lists and open rates. Looking what's happening with membership and people who are making small dollar contributions. And so if we put those numbers front and center, we're less likely to chase the will-o'-the-wisp of a big viral hit into a cul-de-sac.
And I've read you talk about there's basically two components to your audience. So there are the probably relatively affluent, media savvy people who just need that local news that they're not getting, from all the other media. And then there's the underserved in New York. So you talk a little bit about those two different audiences and how you approach that.
Yeah, I describe our audience a little bit as a barbell, with a bulge on kind of each end of the income distribution and the power distribution in some ways. And I think that's a complicated and challenging bimodal strategy to pull off, but a huge amount of power also comes from it, because the people who are most affected by public policy and the quality of public services and so on are also the people who should most be heard by people who have the power to influence policy. And so that is very much the way we work. We definitely have a pretty dedicated audience among people who either just care about New York City, who identify with civic progress, reform, their neighborhoods. And, there's a very long tradition of that. And there are neighborhoods where it's seen as traditionally concentrated, high turnout neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods like Park Slope and the Upper West Side, but also newer centers of that kind of vibrancy, Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, Long Island City, places where people are moving to, and lots of the most engaged media consumers, but also some of the most interesting new players in the city's politics, Crown Heights, places like that, are living. So those kinds of folks, but then of course also people who are actually involved in advocacy, nonprofits, the staff of elected leaders, people in the council, and so on. And clearly, being credible with those audiences greatly increases your chances of having impact with your investigative reporting. But ultimately, if all you do is super serve that audience, you're going to miss stories and you're not going to execute on a mission that is about providing a healthier information environment and a more equitable information environment for everyone. So we try to do a lot of work to listen to what's going on in communities, understand what people's information needs are, and develop journalism that's responsive to that, whether it's through open newsrooms or input on our, to responses to tips, or just reporters who are deeply connected and who look first for what the outcome of policy choices or the actions of more powerful people is likely to be for people who are more underserved. So a bit like the metrics question is a good segue, reminding ourselves of that, baking it into our commissioning and our story decisions, and actually looking fairly actively for opportunities to be helpful, whether being helpful means delivering an impact like our coverage in 2021 and into 2022 of delivery bike workers was cited by all of the city council members who proposed new legislation to protect their labor conditions as its primary inspiration. And that was the result of spending a lot of time with deliveristas, listening to them, but then executing journalism to a very high standard that council members could take seriously. So we look for those kinds of opportunities for impact, but we also look for ways in which reported explanation can serve people who have to navigate nightmarishly complex bureaucracies and so on. And that really seems to work. People find it through search because they ask questions of Google that they also want to ask of a smart neighbor. Yeah. So where we don't have as much of an audience is, the middle between those two. And that's a challenge for the future.
Yeah. You mentioned open newsrooms. Talk a little bit about how that works and why you do that.
Open newsrooms are a way to listen to communities and involve them in the news process. And they can play out in a number of different ways. One format is that you simply hold an off-the-record conversation at a place that is easily accessible by people, sometimes in, for example, a public library branch, possibly partner with some community organizations to make sure you get an interesting mix of people there. And you just ask people what's on their minds, listen to them, and try to take some feedback back to the newsroom and develop stories from that. Sometimes they have more of a kind of town hall quality. They're more public, they're more on the record. You might put together a few. For example, we did a bunch of work last year on what happens when schools call 911 when kids are in psychiatric crisis. Oftentimes that results in young kids, usually young kids of color, in handcuffs instead of in the care of a mental health professional. And so for something like that, we put together an event at the Brooklyn Public Library with some experts in the field and our partners from Chalkbeat and some community organizations, and had what I hope was a helpful conversation about how to deal with those issues and where to access resources and so on.
For newsrooms that are intrigued by that, are there any tips you would have for implementing it and maybe mistakes to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the most important tip is you need to have partners whom you can work with. Don't expect that you can show up in a community and, have any credibility on your own or even get people there necessarily. So I think borrowing some tips from community organizing and finding the right partners and being comfortable with the fact that they are not news organizations. They'll have a different view of the world from you, but they provide an entry and they have knowledge that you don't have. So I think that's key. And then being journalists, although being a good listener is a very important part of being a good journalist, being in those settings and being able to listen in a kind of humble receptive way. This is not technical advice; it's more how do you show up in the world advice. I think is critical, and thinking and being reflective on how it feels to people when you ask questions the way we tend to ask questions, and maybe thinking a little differently about what is going to elicit answers that you don't expect instead of priming people for the answers that you do expect, which is something that we all have a tendency to do. Um, yeah, so I think those are the key things, and don't do the opposite of those things. Don't show up with a pre-baked agenda. Don't assume that people even know who you are, let alone trust you, and work to plug those gaps.
Let's talk a little bit about your financial model and sustainability. So, philanthropy is a big part of it. What are the other components?
Yeah, so philanthropy is the biggest engine of it, mixed between institutional philanthropy and larger individual gifts. The other components are membership and corporate sponsorship. Membership is gifts that total over a year less than $1,000, and that accounts for about 12% of our total revenue, about $560,000 last year, and that's really powerful. It's your readers putting money voluntarily behind what you do, not to get through the paywall, but to signal that they value the work. And I would love to see that grow significantly. It grew quite a bit last year. We went from about 3,200 people giving to about 5,000 people giving last year. And then corporate sponsorship is a mix of public radio style underwriting and more advertising, which is not that whole market is in essentially crisis, whichever way you slice it. So it's not hugely remunerative, but it certainly adds at the margin. And in New York City, of course, we have the Mayor's Office of Community and Ethnic Media, which implementing Local Law 57 tries to ensure that a certain amount of city advertising goes to community outlets. So we're able to earn a little bit over there at rates that are a little better than what you get from auctioning yourself off on an ad tech platform.
Yeah, the that last piece has caught a good bit of interest in my field of press associations and others who are looking at their local cities and states. And I'm just curious. Part of what I've heard from some outlets and even the city and CUNY about that program is that there have been some benefits to the city from actually advertising in these outlets that they didn't realize until they were kind of forced to, that these local ethnic and community outlets have a different relationship with their community. They're reaching audiences that mainstream media might not, and social media might not. Has that been your experience in working with the city?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have very deep qualitative insights into it, but it's certainly true just from a classical advertising metrics perspective that we see higher click-through rates than you would expect, or than sort of typical industry benchmarks when we carry those ads. And that says to me that we're reaching people that are engaged with these issues, that are present locally. We're not shoving a story in front of 15 million international readers who care about a viral moment in New York. We're reaching people who live here, who need these services, who may not be aware of them. And so the returns are just superior as a result.
And for publishers who are outside of New York, particularly small community outlets, they might hear numbers, and if they don't think about the competition in New York, they might assume that you're in the advertising capital of the world, you've got a great audience, and philanthropy and advertising would both just kind of flow in the door on its own. You turn on the spigot. But last year, I know you had some cuts in philanthropy. Semaphore covered that, and your staff volunteered to take pay cuts. So talk a little bit about sustainability and stability and what your approach is to that.
It's tough. I think we are all the things you said about New York City are true, right? This is a place where there are tremendous resources. And so you might imagine that the streets are paved with gold and you just have to walk around and pick it up. But nonprofit news is still a new category for philanthropy. And People have deeply established patterns of giving. They know what it is to give to the ballet or the Natural History Museum or their local hospital. And the networks around all of those things and the practices are deeply established. These are real institutions of New York City life, and people have deep and long relationships with them. And we're showing up in a new category and saying, hey, well, if you want to have a thriving civic information environment, you might want to consider adding local news to the list of things that you fund. And we provide a kind of information infrastructure that's akin to libraries or parks or schools, other categories that people give in. But we are making the case for this new thing in an environment of intense philanthropic sophistication and competition. And it's tough. It's also an expensive place. We want to pay people properly to live in an expensive town. Rent is high. Everything is expensive. So that's the challenge on the other side of the income statement. And while there is a lot of philanthropic excitement nationally with Press Forward and other initiatives, it's the speed at which these things happen is the speed at which it happens. So it's really challenging. I think we have the opportunity to build something incredibly powerful here, and there are ways in which being in a city that has so much scale, just journalistically and from a product perspective and an audience perspective, enables us to try some things and build some things that are going to be relevant elsewhere. But anyone who sits in these roles will tell you that almost wherever you are, it's exceptionally tough.
And so, what's your approach to sort of managing that and charting a financial plan for the organization?
I think that there are a few keys to it. One is that you need to have enough investment in fundraising and the business side, and not simply believe that if you build it, they will come. And so the temptation is, and certainly our staffing structure was a few years ago, overwhelmingly the costs were overwhelmingly dedicated to the journalism. And obviously it's crucial to have as much of your resources going into the journalism as possible in a context where you have enough to drive sustainability. You have a professional fundraising operation, you have solid financial management, and also that you have enough product capability and marketing capability to actually get in front of people. And this is something the American Journalism Project emphasizes everywhere it goes. We really do need to build out business infrastructure. So that's certainly what we're trying to do. I think also, and certainly, a lesson that I took in last year after 2 years of, quite robust growth in 2021 and 2022, was that all of the promise of the new enthusiasm for local news as a category doesn't mean that the money is here yet. We still have to be really patient and try to lay a foundation for growth, because the scale of the available resources is not yet commensurate with the scale of the crisis. And so we're going to have to go a little bit deliberately.
What tips do you have for nonprofit leaders and publishers who are looking for those revenue people, whether it's ad sales or grant writers or just development people?
I think you want to have those people really integrated in your leadership team and show them that that they are a key part of the strategy. Not think of it as an adjunct. And I think that when we're trying to hire a new head of development at the moment, and we're not able to pay at the level that a museum is able to necessarily, or certainly a hospital or a university. But there are a lot of great development professionals who want to be part of a compelling mission and who want to be part of its strategic leadership. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other thing is that I really think it's worth having product and technology leadership kind of at your top table. We all have to get beyond putting a lot of words on a page and leaving it at that. Advertising is not really a nut that I've cracked. We have had some success with corporate sponsorship. We recently inked a fairly significant, by our standards, deal with JP Morgan Chase, which was also associated with a bigger deal that American Journalism Project did. I think there we are, the question of how much to invest relative to the return in this ad market is a complicated one. And I wish I had great advice about that. And I think it's just like have to keep the costs down, but not down so much that you don't actually deliver anything.
Talk a little bit about your journey to the city. A couple jobs ago, you were chief content officer at Hindustan Times, the second largest English language publication in India. I think I read you had 500 staff and a large budget, obviously, to go along with that. I assume in Johannesburg, your paper there was considerably bigger in terms of staff. What's it been like to go from those much larger institutions and broader scope too editorially to managing a much smaller staff and a tighter focus?
I mean, I've spent most of my career working in legacy institutions of one kind or another, at different scales. HT Hindustan Times was actually close to 1,000 people in the newsroom, and then Human Rights Watch was 500. The Mail and Guardian was smaller, about 100, and it's enormously different. Having a lot of people around you means that you spend a lot of your time as a leader essentially hiring, setting the culture, and delegating. And, in a role like this one, you just have to do a heck of a lot more yourself. And it's a complex balance that I don't think I've always got right. What do you take on yourself? What do you share off board? How do you create consultation and support around what you're doing, even in a smaller setting, and trust people? On the other hand, there's vastly less inertia, and if you want to move things, you can move them, which is pretty amazing. And then the narrowness of focus does not bother me at all. In fact, I find it kind of great. I mean, firstly, New York City obviously contains multitudes, even if you are limiting yourself to accountability reporting and service journalism. And I think having clarity in this media environment is a wonderful thing, and you can find all kinds of richness within a clear and more delimited scope. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was that I had been part of, for the preceding 4 years, Human Rights Watch, a massive global NGO, and I would literally go to like 15 countries in a year. And one day I'm in Japan talking to the finance committee of the Diet about, Chinese finance technology and privacy, and the next week I'm in Brazil talking to the foreign minister about the Amazon. Um, and while our investigative work at Human Rights Watch was incredibly rigorous and credible, and I felt very proud and confident making advocacy arguments based on those investigations, I was some random dude who showed up from thousands of miles away. And working at a local level means you're literally, looking across the table at the people whom you're reporting on. You live side by side with them, and you can see the impact of your work. You have a kind of locus standi. People can call you out on it and praise you on it. And that's just an incredibly satisfying and compelling place to be in.
And that bridges me to my next question, which is going from Human Rights Watch back into journalism and leading a completely different type of organization. What did you learn just about management and organizational leadership coming from that environment that maybe you wouldn't have had if you had stayed purely in journalism?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and in a way, I think that the challenges that international NGOs have had with management, and they've had a lot over the last 10 years, are quite similar to some of the challenges that news organizations have faced. They attract quite similar people who are mission driven and often quite convinced of themselves, who have been elevated into management because they're great professionals, not necessarily because they're people who care about management. And they also have cultures where the outcome, whether it's an advocacy outcome like Human Rights Watch pursues, or a humanitarian outcome like getting the food to the kids, is placed above all else, placed above the people's health and happiness, and sometimes even above ethics in the conduct of the work. And there's quite a lot of that in news organizations too. And so I think what I learned at scale in Human Rights Watch dovetailed quite closely with things that I learned, for example, at Hindustan Times, and that I think are really relevant in news organizations. So believing that management is important, having an internal culture that prioritizes diversity, that prioritizes accountability at all levels, that is collaborative and open and constructive. Those kinds of things go just as strongly in news organizations as they do in international nonprofits. But international nonprofits maybe started investing in them a little earlier because the crises they had were more severe and more visible. Yeah. So, and I think the issues around building diversity and having a both an approach to diversity that centers it across your strategy is an area where NGOs also have had similar problems to news outlets, heavily white organizations with a very strong normative culture that grows out of that demography. And so tackling that, reversing it and trying to build more inclusive cultures that represent and look like the people who work there is a very relevant set of shared challenges that we have and that other nonprofits do.
On that diversity point, I think a lot of people particularly in rural America or into states that just aren't quite as diverse, might assume that you have it a lot easier in diversifying your staff, but I have a suspicion that it's still challenging. What's been your experience there?
I think we've been able to hire, incredible reporters and editors of all kinds of backgrounds. And, one big advantage in that is CUNY and the J School, which is, it's a great J School, and it really plays an important role in building a cohort of reporters and editors who come from all backgrounds in New York City and who have the chops. So that has helped. I mean, certainly holding on to people in a in a market where we are elevating their work to a high level of visibility, and it can be seen by the New York Times or Bloomberg or people like that in a way that it might not be if we were in a smaller town, means we have to work twice as hard to retain people. So we haven't struggled to hire a diverse team, maintaining that diversity, making sure that it's actually given full expression in the culture of the organization, in our editorial decisions. Obviously, that is a work of kind of pretty constant vigilance and hopefully, positive intent as well.
So now we can move to our rapid fire questions, and the questions will be quick, but your answers don't have to be, and I might even ask for elaboration. So for first question, compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
I am both more optimistic and less optimistic. On the positive side of the ledger, I think we've got a pretty clear sense of what works now. Local nonprofits were all over the Pulitzer Prize list. They've driven the news on some of the biggest stories of the day, everywhere from San Francisco to Mississippi to us here in New York City. I think there's a growing understanding beyond our own sector of how deep the crisis is and how urgent their task of rebuilding is. And we're seeing more and more outlets create sustainable plans to provide an answer. So we have more models. We have, just an extraordinary growing national network of new local news organizations, which are going to be at least guideposts to the future, even if they themselves aren't the ultimate answer. So I'm really optimistic about that and about the community that's working on these issues. On the other hand, I think the pressures are continuing to build, and we're continuing to see red ink, all over commercial media balance sheets. We're continuing to see retrenchment and pullback. For many of them, the public radio system is under huge pressure, and I don't think that the nonprofit resources or the philanthropy resources are swinging in the direction of an answer nearly as fast as the damage is being done. So I think it's a very hopeful moment, and we're kind of building the beginning of a bridge to whatever the future is, but it's fragile too.
Speaking of the future, does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
At the risk of being boring, I'm also going to say both, and I think we have to understand the impact of AI in all its dimensions, and starting with what it means for our overall operating environment. What do we cover? What is the information ecosystem that we're working in look like? How does it impact our business models? Can we make use of it in our newsrooms? And those in a if the development of these systems is such that our overall information ecosystem becomes profoundly polluted by fakery or highly targeted polarizing content, and then we have to battle in that space, that's a terrifying thing. Of course, for us and for smaller news organizations, there is some hope, I think, that we can scale up our effectiveness by building tools that empower reporters and editors. For example, at the city, we're experimenting with a few different AI tools. We built a tool to map all of our coverage and see if it's true that we, in fact, cover the whole of New York. And we were able to do that for, a few $1,000 instead of many tens of thousands of human time tagging stories. We're also building a chatbot that'll be trained entirely on our own service journalism and hopefully be able to answer readers' questions accurately based on our prior reporting. So I think thoughtful, targeted uses of these technologies in under-resourced newsrooms could be very helpful. But there are also profound threats even to a nonprofit business model. For example, if large language model summaries displace search results so far down the page as they're already starting to do, discovery of our work and what we do and the whole pipeline to deliver people to membership or to show donors that we're actually reaching them gets put under pressure. And we don't have the resources or the heft to be battling tech companies over intellectual property the way that, for example, the New York Times is. So we have to leave our fate a little bit in the hands of others. There's also very unequal access to the kinds of engineering and other tech resources you might need to take advantage of this stuff. And we were already seeing what happens on apps like Newsbreak or the cannibalization of the local space by AI. So I have all kinds of pretty concrete fears, I think, but also a sense that we need to work in the space.
Messy desk or clean desk?
Messy disk.
Do you have a favorite piece of advice that you've received or that you like to give?
I think the thing that's mattered the most to me and has made the most difference is don't think you have to do everything yourself. Your team actually wants to help you, and they want you to rely on them. Corollary of that is that when you're in a leadership role, you don't have to be completely invincible. You don't have to be the one that never takes a break and that is always there first and leaves last, and quote unquote set an example. What I've learned a little bit is that when you do that, which I'm certainly tempted to, it can put impossible pressure on everyone else to be like you and set the tone in a way that you will ultimately find is unhelpful.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that drives you crazy in its wrongness or oversimplification?
There are many many such pieces of conventional wisdom. I think if in our space, the thing that makes me the craziest is the idea that it's just enough to do great work, and that journalistic quality will out, people will find you, and you'll get results. I think we have to be much more intentional about getting our work in front of people, growing it, and actually investing in making sure that we are relevant and that we're in the conversation. If you build it, they will come is not a mantra for success in our business.
Silicon Valley's valorized favor of the last decade or two. Journalists find that hard to come by. Of course, there has been a lot of damage by some of those failures, but more so by their successes. And journalists always want to get things right, but I think failure is an important part of life and certainly business. Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
I mean, the failures that I think about the most are ones that I've made more in an editorial context, but that also teach me things about working on the business side. And for example, when I was the editor of the Mail and Guardian back in South Africa, we had a very celebrated cartoonist named Zapiro, whose people would wait for his cartoon to drop every week. And he was a kind of national figure in many ways, larger than anyone else on our staff. And I think it was in 2012 or 2011, a number of years after the original Prophet Muhammad cartoons, there was an international cartoonists Everybody Draw Muhammad Day. And our cartoonist did a very gentle, non-Islamophobic, sort of mildly amusing cartoon depicting the Prophet Muhammad making a joke to his therapist. And he sent it over to me. And usually we would spend like an hour or so discussing his cartoon. We didn't really, I was a bit distracted and I just let it go in the paper. I thought it would be fine. And that was obviously like a profound lack of cultural competence on my part. And we would pin the ready pages of the paper that I'd signed off up on the wall. And as the last pages were going to press, so one of my staff came over to me and said, "You realize that that cartoon is going to be a problem." And by that point, it was too late. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, maybe it is." It seemed mild to me, but maybe it isn't. And by the next day, we were facing calls for a boycott of the paper, death threats to the staff. I had to get a bodyguard and meet with the leadership of the Muslim community in Johannesburg to talk through why we'd published the cartoon. And then there was huge pressure from both sides of the spectrum, from free speech advocates who said, hang tough, you did the right thing, that's the brand of your newspaper, and deeply aggrieved and offended people who wanted a full-throated apology. And so I learned a lot from navigating that process and coming up with a nuanced set of answers. But the fundamental thing really was that it was a kind of cultural political blind spot that I'd had in passing the cartoon without more thought, and that I needed to have, since I had that blind spot myself, I needed to more intentionally create ways to hear from other people in the newsroom more consistently. And I've had other varieties of that same failure, and I think about it a lot.
This industry's tough. Lots of industries are tough, but sometimes it seems particularly tough, particularly in this election environment. And as you just alluded to, sometimes you face death threats for just doing your job. What's one thing you do to maintain your sanity and restore yourself?
Yeah, I ride my bike or go to the hills. New York City, probably contrary to popular belief, is a great town to be a cyclist in. So I will hop on the Metro North and go a little bit up the Hudson and go ride my gravel bike in the woods, or get on my road bike and cycle out to Nyack and the hills beyond. New York City offers incredible access to some pretty stunning countryside as well. So, and if it's not on the bike, I'll go run or hike and spend long hours doing that, clear my head.
And you alluded to earlier sort of the need to have a healthy culture and work life for your staff. What are some tips or things you do as a leader to help your staff maintain its sanity and mental health?
Yeah, I mean, again, one thing we do is to talk about that and to prioritize it as a value, and not project a kind of toughness is the answer approach to work and life and mental health. We have brought in the Dart Center to talk with people, particularly in the immediate aftermath of COVID, just about the stresses that were building up and ways to manage unremitting stress and find space. We try to have obviously decent, hard policies about leave and time off and so on, and to celebrate that and to nudge people in the direction of taking their time. So a lot of this is kind of culture setting stuff, and how do you message time off, and how do you talk about your own activities? So we try to have the right policies and procedures, and then also a culture that leans in that direction. And generally with journalists, your problem is never going to be that you have to like harass people into doing stuff. It's more like you have to harass them into not doing stuff.
Yeah, I think that's when you were talking about the NGO, mission-driven people and how that's similar to journalism. I think it's a particular problem for mission-driven fields where it can almost be manipulative, either from your own standpoint, sometimes even that you feel like you have this burden on you to save democracy or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's so huge and impossible that you can completely sacrifice yourself on its altar and see only an incremental contribution, and it's never ending. Actually, someone, when I was at Human Rights Watch, a counselor that we brought in to work with our staff and support them in thinking differently about these things, she noted how everyone would say, well, like, I'm having a tough time, but the people I work with, it's so much worse for them if they're human rights defenders or refugees. And she said, it's not an Olympics of suffering. You don't have to win the medal in having the hardest time for the way you feel to be justified. And I think that Olympics of suffering approach can happen in newsrooms as well. And yeah, we need to be quite conscious in avoiding those tropes.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
I mean, brush your teeth in the shower. In New York City, I don't know if this applies to everyone, but take the subway or ride your bike. Never drive.
5 years out, what does wild success look like for the city?
Wild success, I think, really means that we are able to be the place where the New York City conversation is convened, and the place where New Yorkers are able to converge around a trusted set of facts. And so that means we're probably about twice, I think we can do that at about twice our current size and have powerful investigative reporting, data reporting, service journalism as we currently do, but a broader palette and a richer set of ways to meet our audience that aren't just text and data journalism on a page, but that include video-based formats, audio, other places to reach people. But fundamentally, if we think about it in outcomes terms, it means that we are the primary locus for New York City news in New York.
And now the last two questions are recommendations. Obviously, you get lots of visitors to the city. What are 3 to 5 places you would recommend people coming from out of town?
I think a lot of people don't realize that New York City is a beach town, and you can get to the beach on public transit. You can either take the New York City ferry, which is kind of amazing, all the way to Rockaway, or you can take the subway to a bunch of different beaches. I particularly like Jacob Riis Beach, which is a beautiful expanse of sand. It has some great food concessions. There are a few sharks, but seemingly under control this year, and the Park Service and the city fly drones to look out for them. So strong recommendation for New York City as a beach town. You can even take surfing lessons in Rockaway. Another very classic one is to go to food court in Queens. I would suggest the New York food court, which is in Flushing. Incredible, mostly Chinese food outlets there, and just an evening in a part of town that you may not go to on the regular tourist map. And maybe if that doesn't work for you and you want to do the classic take the ferry to Staten Island, I think getting on the water is a good idea if you can make it happen. Take the free ferry to Staten Island and take a bit of a walk over to Victory Boulevard, probably take about 20 minutes and get some Sri Lankan food. I think if you're in the museum district and you're going to the Met, you should pop up the road to the Museum of the City of New York, which has amazing historical exhibits on the city, and you'll understand the place you're in hugely better after a few hours at the Museum of the City of New York. And then finally, maybe, I'm sure people will want to do Broadway or those kinds of things. A different sort of evening might be to go to one of the poetry evenings at the KGB bar on the Lower East Side. There's a long history as a literary gathering spot in New York. You can hear some of the most celebrated poets in the country there and have a beer.
Do you have a favorite Indian or South African restaurant?
I do not have a favorite South African restaurant. I do like, for Sri Lankan, I do like New Asha on Staten Island. I strongly recommend that. It's very, very cheap, less than $10, kind of amazing. For fancier Indian food, there's a restaurant group that owns 3 or 4 relatively high-end but incredibly authentic and very, very good restaurants. And my favorite of those is one called Dhamaka, which is on the Lower East Side. Absolutely astonishingly great Indian food. But there are lots of more mom and pop places that are good too.
And then final question, 3 to 5 media recommendations, any form of media.
I thought hard about what to recommend here, and so one thing I would say is that I think that I'm spending a lot of time with media that is about the real structure of the economy, and for people who don't already listen to it, I'd strongly recommend the Odd Lots podcast from Bloomberg, which has the Odd Lots team, Joe Wiesenthal and Tracy Alloway, ask questions in a very curious and open way. And they bring in great experts and they make sense of things you may never have thought of, like why is Tractor Supply Company thriving and how is that connected to larger forces going on in national life. And at a global level, Adam Tooze, the Columbia economic historian, posts an amazing list of links every week called Chartbook, which connects what's going on at the Federal Reserve to the politics of climate change. For people in local news, I think lots of the big forces that are acting on us get explored in both of those outlets. For entertainment, if I can call it that, I've just finished reading Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which was, I think, last year's Booker Prize winner. Absolutely chilling, incredibly lyrical, powerful depiction of Ireland as it falls under the spell of a right-wing nationalist leader and drifts into authoritarianism. And it's a slightly terrifying but also very gorgeously written echo of our current moment.
Well, thank you very much, Nic. This has been a treat.
Thanks, Tim. Really fun.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.